Everyone, hi. I'm Frederick Mayer. I'm the Dean of the Korbel School. Welcome. I hope you're all doing well, or as well as can be expected in this amazing time. Thanks so much for being with us this evening for the virtual Majlis. We're very excited this evening, obviously, to welcome George Packer. Certainly, personally, for me, it's a great pleasure. I've been a long-time admirer of his work. Before we start, let me thank a couple of people. Well, Judith Judd in particular, a friend to all of you, I think, and whose generosity and dedication to this project really makes it happen. I want to acknowledge Chris Hill, my predecessor as Dean at Korbel School, who of course is well known to George Packer, and we were just talking earlier, they know each other well, for overlapped in several spaces, I know. So my duty here this evening is really to introduce our speaker and then to hand to my colleague, Professor Nader Hashemi, Director of our Center of Middle East Studies, who will have a conversation with Mr. Packer. How to introduce George Packer? He's simply one of America's greatest and most important journalists and writers on public affairs. As you know, he's currently a staff writer for The Atlantic. He wrote for many years, 15 years at The New Yorker, where he covered, among other things, the Iraq War and many other topics, really a remarkable output. His book, The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, was named one of New York Times 10 best books in 2005. Won several other awards. I think they've retired the Overseas Press Club Award for all of his awards. Great book, by the way. I've used that in my classes. He's also the author of The Village of Waiting, about his experience in the Peace Corps in Africa, The Blood of Liberals, which I'd love to read. I've not. A non-generational nonfiction history of his family and American liberalism in the 20th century, which also won the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He's written 2 novels, millions of other articles in every outlet you can imagine, many awards. His most recent books are The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America, and Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and the End of the American Century. And as you know, I think you've read his recent article in The Atlantic. It's really a searing account of the state of our polity. I think it's one of the most trenchant and sobering accounts of the challenge we face right now as a country. And you don't have to agree with everything he says to recognize the truth that this pandemic has really put into sharp relief failings that we've long ignored: growing inequality, extreme partisanship, and of course the hollowing out of our institutions of governance. His line, every morning in the endless month of March, Americans woke up to find themselves citizens of a failed state, has really stuck with me. Strong words, but I must say, as a dean of a School of Public and International Affairs, I found that a kind of bracing call to action, and perhaps not just for us at the school, but for all of us as citizens. So I'm very eager to hear the conversation this evening. I get to be part of the audience and enjoy that. Thank you so much, George, for being with us this evening. We really appreciate it.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you all for having me and for joining me on a Wednesday night.
Yeah, thank you. So it's now my pleasure to turn the proceedings over to my colleague, Nader Hashemi.
Thank you everyone for being with us, and a special thanks to George for taking time out of his busy schedule.
It's not that busy these days, Nader.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. Just a clarification about the question and answer session. In about half an hour, we will start taking questions for George Packer, and you can pose a question by writing it up in the chat room, and then we'll start reading them off, and we'll end roughly at the top of the hour with some concluding remarks from Judith Judd. So let me begin, George, first by congratulating you on being a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for your intellectual biography of Richard Holbrooke. I'm not sure how many people know that, but I'm sorry you didn't win, but I hope the recognition will translate into good book sales, and we hope we can bring you to Denver to talk about Richard Holbrooke and U.S. foreign policy for obvious reasons.
I'd love to.
And that book is just, a perfect fit. But I want to return to U.S. foreign policy later on and begin with your really powerful and poignant essay in The Atlantic, We Are Living in a Failed State. I see this essay as deeply connected to your 2013 book that Fritz mentioned, The Unwinding, the Inner History of the New America, where you explore the decline of democracy in the United States, the eroding of the American social contract. Could you discuss how your book informed your recent essay in The Atlantic, which really reads to me as an epilogue to a possible new edition of The Unwinding? How are the two pieces related?
You're right, Nader. They're very intimately related, although they're 7 years apart. I worked on The Unwinding essentially during the years of the Great Recession, 2009 to 2011 or 12. And it's a portrait of the country through biography, really, through the stories of a handful of Americans who are unknown and who live in forgotten places the media tend to overlook, like Western North Carolina, the Piedmont area of North Carolina, or Youngstown, Ohio, or the exurbs around Tampa Bay. And it's a picture of a few individuals who are struggling economically. It kind of tells the story of their lives, each of them maybe in their 40s. So they're my generation, people who came of age during the Reagan and Clinton years. And they are all struggling. They are all in some ways cut off from any institutional support of the kind that Americans took for granted maybe a generation earlier, whether it's from the government, federal, state, local, whether it's from a corporation or a bank or a secure job, a newspaper that gives them vital information. They're kind of all on their own. And so it's a picture of both individual resourcefulness and effort and imagination and institutional collapse. And it wasn't hard to get that picture. All I had to do was leave New York City or leave Washington and go out into small towns where the main streets were all shuttered because the only commercial life was up on at the big box stores on the highway. This story was the same everywhere, and the sense that the middle class was disappearing and that the system seemed to be rigged against these people and their children if they had them. That's the picture in The Unwinding, and it's all narrative. It's not an analytical book. It doesn't have 10 policy proposals at the end for how to fix what ails us. And I wondered if maybe it was too pessimistic. I even thought at one point of including Donald Trump in the book. There are these dozen or so profiles of famous people scattered among the stories of these unknown people, and they come from different walks of life. There's Newt Gingrich from politics, and there's Robert Rubin from finance, and Elizabeth Warren, and a whole bunch of people. I thought about including Trump, and I decided he was too easy to caricature, because at that point Trump was just a New York Post tabloid figure with a TV show. A few years later, he became president, and people began to say, oh, The Unwinding predicted this. The Unwinding saw Trump coming. It's not quite true. I did not imagine Donald Trump as president. I didn't think we had unwound that far. But it turned out the country was way out ahead of my imagination. And we've been speeding along ever since. And yet I think we had gotten a bit used to being led by a celebrity with no experience in government until the coronavirus. And suddenly the hollowness of our government and the pathologies, as Fritz put it, of our social contract, all of which were the subject of the unwinding, became unavoidably clear, almost painfully, just exaggeratedly clear. Every day there was another story about how the White House was incapable of procuring vital medical equipment and didn't even seem to be trying, or how expert doctors from the CDC were being shut up, or how workers in warehouses were being told they had to come to work even if they had a fever. So just horrors descending on our heads. To me, it all reminded me of sort of the stirrings of this in the unwinding, but it was all much more extreme. It has become much more extreme. So in a way, yeah, that I would say the unwinding was like a long prologue to the climax, and we're living in the climax right now. At least I hope we are, because I don't think we can take too much more of this kind of catastrophe.
In your Atlantic essay, you rightfully and eloquently, criticized Donald Trump. The section on Jared Kushner is actually quite brilliant. You criticized the Republican Party. I'm wondering if I can draw you out on your evaluation of how the Democratic Party has responded to this colossal crisis. 72,000 dead Americans and counting every day, 22 plus unemployed, and it looks like we're still in the early phases of this crisis. Could you share with us an evaluation of the other party in this country?
Well, I think readers of the unwinding will remember that Joe Biden is a character in the book. There's a major character who was an aide to Biden during his Senate years. And so we see Biden through the eyes of this aide who begins by idealizing him and ends up with a rather cynical view of both Biden and of Washington. So I try not to turn a blind eye to either party. And I think right now the Democratic Party is missing in action. The House of Representatives, which is the branch or the House that the Democrats control, is absent, physically absent. They're not holding hearings. They are, there's no leadership coming from the Democrats. Where would that leadership come from? It would either come from Nancy Pelosi or from Biden himself, but neither of them has tried to be maybe the shadow leader that some of us think we need. Since there's such a vacuum of leadership in the White House, the natural thing is to turn to the opposition to fill that role, and there's no one doing it. And so the endless spectacle of Donald Trump in front of the cameras, there's no break to it. There's no counterpoint to it. And so I think when I called us a failed state, I didn't mean it in the textbook sense, which I'm sure you study at the Corbell Center. I mean, at the Corbell School, and I'm sure you and others in this conversation have lived in failed states. I have. Iraq was a failed state. Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, I've reported from them. We're not that. There's not outbreaks of violence and sectarian warfare. We have a functioning police force. We have functioning government services. We're a failed state. I wrote that phrase because I suddenly had a almost shiver in my nervous system of remembering what it's like to be in those other countries where no one expects the government to be able to provide leadership or advice or information or even concern. It's as if you're orphaned. There is no one in charge. You are on your own. And in March, and even now, I think a lot of Americans felt that way. And that opened up a place for a Democratic politician to step in. And no one has. On the state level, they have. I'm in New York. People tune into Andrew Cuomo's press conferences, like their favorite TV show, and are hanging on his every word. And I think that's partly because he has risen to the occasion, and it's also because there was a vacuum. that needed to be filled, but it hasn't been filled at the national level.
Let's turn to foreign policy. You've covered different parts of the world. Your recent book is on U.S. foreign policy, and Richard Holbrooke. One of the big questions that we are facing internationally now is, our future relationship with China. And the tension seems to be as follows in my reading. On the one hand, we don't want to start a Cold War with China. We need to cooperate with China to deal with this crisis and future pandemics. But on the other hand, China is in many ways, deeply responsible for this crisis because of the cover-up, the silencing of the medical doctors and journalists, the obfuscation, etc. So in your evaluation, how do you sort of balance these two moral imperatives in terms of what a future, relationship with China would look like? And the sort of added question is, you're the best person to ask this added question. What would Richard Holbrooke say if he was around?
Well, China is not my area of expertise by any stretch. So I'm going to be like your average informed newspaper reader in answering your question, who thinks about foreign policy a fair amount, but I don't have any special insight into the U.S.-China relationship, and maybe others, as we open this up, will want to weigh in on that. I think you described the dilemma perfectly. China bears great responsibility. They could not be trusted at the beginning. They can't be trusted now. I don't believe the numbers I see. Every day I go to the Worldometer coronavirus numbers, and China remains way down at like 4,000 deaths. I don't believe that. So I think they, as any authoritarian state, they want to control the information and to conceal bad news from their own people and from the world. And they are better at it than we are because they are authoritarian. They also had the advantage as an authoritarian state of being able to impose draconian rules on their people that people had to follow. And so they do seem to have contained it better than we have, and better than a lot of democratic countries have. There's an impulse toward nationalism during a crisis like this, where each country thinks we have to have our own medical supply industry. We have to fight like hell in order to secure supplies and keep other countries from getting supplies that we might be able to get. In other words, there's a very strong impulse for dog eat dog, and for each to look out after itself. And unfortunately, it's hit at a moment when the United States is in a profoundly selfish period, where that's become the impulse, the reflex of our government, of our top officials. So they are giving into that. They're cutting off the World Health Organization, treating Germany like some sort of a competitor that we have to outmuscle so they don't outmuscle us, and essentially saying everyone's on their own. I think that's a terrible mistake, both for humanitarian reasons and also just for geopolitical reasons. It's going to lead to more hardship, toward more isolation, and toward, it's actually in some ways that impulse that got us into the place we're in right now. Because we, as everyone knows, we withdrew our CDC observers who had been in China. We did not cooperate on supply lines with other countries. We did all sorts of things to cut ourselves off at the knees. And so now we are in the situation we're in. And so I think we need leadership that can explain to the American people why it's important that even though we're angry at China, even though we want answers and will demand answers, getting into a Cold War with China right now would make matters a lot worse for us as well as for the rest of the world. It's hard to explain it to the country because people are in that state of fear and anger.
And do you have any sense of, if Richard Holbrooke was around today, what he would say about this crisis?
I mean, he would be absolutely stunned by our incompetence and our stupidity in having squandered weeks and weeks and then being unable to get our act together once we turned around and faced it. He would be calling for international action at the UN and in other at every international organization where we have a say and where we are looked to for leadership. There's a lot of things Richard Holbrooke would be doing. He'd be frantic and working all the time, on the phone all the time, but he would be doing that from the era in which he lived. And I'm not sure he would know how to operate in this era. It wouldn't make sense to him that the world no longer looks to us for leadership. He wouldn't understand that. He would try to just argue against it and overwhelm it with his personality, but I'm afraid that's where we are. And so in a way, Richard Holbrooke might be, a little too late. He might be in some ways the wrong man because he understood the world that was created after World War II and the institutions that were the architecture of that world, and they are no longer what they were. So I don't know how he would be able to adjust to the world we're in now. But I want to hear from Chris Hill at the right moment, since he can answer that question better than I can.
Absolutely. Sort of one more question before we shift to the audience. A question about the future, really. You gave a recent interview about your essay in the Atlantic to Vox News, and I just want to be clear, that was Vox News, not Fox News, where you gave your interview, and it was about the future. And you stated the following. You said, quote, "I think we're at a point where people should be asking big questions. People should be really thinking about transformational changes. I hope that's the one thing that can come out of this disaster that might be good." Could you expand on this? Could I pin you down maybe a little bit to talk about what type of transformational change we really need in this country to get out of this mess?
Yeah, I think for years and years, we've all just gotten used to a chronic state of blockage in Washington, where no one expects Congress to solve any problems or to pass any laws even, where we don't expect competent and proactive people to fill the ranks of the civil service and to be given the freedom and the power to do what they need to do in order to solve problems, where we accept a level of inequality and of just deep insecurity in our economy, so that whole industries now, mostly in the service area, which we now call essential work, are invisible and have no serious protections of the kind that workers marched and fought for decades, like healthcare, paid sick leave, worker safety. And we also have basic obstacles to just democracy working, whether it's the right to vote, whether it's the right for the majority to be able to get things done when they're put into office, whether it's the majority to be able to get the candidate that the majority chooses. I think there's a lot of things that we need to think about that we may say, well, how would you get that done? Like, how would you get rid of the Electoral College? How would you bring proportional representation to state elections? How would you organize unions in these new service jobs? How would you get rid of the filibuster? How would you do all kinds of things that may even seem rash? I think we have to be willing to seem rash and ask how we can do those things, because we've sort of been stuck in a state of slow decay for a very long time now. And this pandemic has shown the cost of that and what a second-rate country might look like if it continues on the same path.
Yeah. Well, that was very much, I think it came across in your Atlantic essay. It was I think why it resonated with so many people was precisely because it spoke to those, I think, foundational structural changes that this country needs. And so I want to thank you for that essay. I'm glad to see it's getting the attention that it rightly deserves. Let's now switch over to the second part of the program. When our Majlis group meets, we always have a portion of the program where we allow for participation, questions, and answers. So Gina is going to start reading out some of the questions, and we'll go through as many as we can until we get to the top of the hour, and then we'll say goodbye. So Gina, do you want to go ahead with the first question that you have in front of you?
Sure. The first question is interesting. It says the readings didn't mention the effect that AI will have on society, which I think will have a much greater impact on our lives than the virus, especially unemployment and inequality. Can you comment on that?
Well, like China, AI is not a subject I've spent much time studying. And I always have the feeling that the person who asks a question like that has an answer already and knows a lot more perhaps than I do, but I don't know if our format allows for that kind of back and forth. I mean, that's kind of Andrew Yang's campaign. It moved a lot of people. It got a lot of attention and convinced a lot of people that regardless of what we might want, the direction of the economy and of globalization is toward making human beings non-essential. we will all be non-essential. In fact, there's something about all these Zoom meetings that gives me a kind of a fright, because it seems as if we're all sitting at home chatting on Zoom, maybe no one really will want us back. Maybe Zoom will be the end of the workplace, at least for those who work at a computer. So yeah, I can't really say much more than that. I grew up in Silicon Valley. It was not called Silicon Valley when I was a kid. It was just before it. The Apple II computer came on the market just as I was finishing high school. I've always been suspicious of the utopian optimism that attends the tech industry, because it always struck me that it's an industry, and industries are not utopian. They're industries. They're about profits and products and hopefully solving problems, but they're certainly not automatically going to change the world, which is the cliche out there. And I spent a lot of time during the unwinding work talking to Peter Thiel, who, although he and I have nothing in common politically, he shares my skepticism of the digital revolution. He thinks it's a lot less than it's cracked up to be, and has probably created at least as much pain as profit and pleasure. And I see AI as that times 10. So I don't know much about it except that it scares me, and that it doesn't seem like the answer to the problems that we've been talking about tonight.
Okay, great. Gina, let's go to the next question.
The next question is, who is on top of where all the money is going? This is a multi-part question. Is there a strategy for distribution that is standardized and fair? Are there effective watchdogs? Or are we seeing free-for-all graft and corruption? I have heard from some who have received their $1,200 in whole or in part, and others who have no idea about how or when they will get their distribution.
That's a great question. It may be connected to the question about where is the Democratic Party right now. I have a friend who's a doctor who has been spending the last 3 to 4 weeks trying to get the paycheck protection program money for his small practice, which he owns. And it's been hell because most of the first tranche went to big corporations that found ways to claim that they were small businesses, and the big banks were not dealing with small customers, and all the problems of bigness and of concentration that we saw in 2008 and 2009. We don't seem to have learned those lessons, and we're back where we were then 10, 12 years ago. I think we need oversight. The House should be holding hearings. They could find a way to do it, even if they can't all be in the same room. There were some watchdogs put in place in the first stimulus bill, but Trump has, as he always does, has found ways to try to defang them so that they won't be able to find out exactly what he and his family and his donors are doing with the money and what kind of advantages they're getting. I think we're going to find out when $3 trillion goes out the door that fast and with that few safeguards that the corruption, the risk of corruption is staggering. And my guess is over the next year or two, if Congress is allowed to do its job, we'll find out that it was, although may well have helped some people and prevented some disasters in small businesses and for individuals who needed the money, it also, I'm sure, has been an enormous boondoggle for those who know how to get their hands on money in Washington.
Great. Gina, let's go to the next question.
Okay, the next question is related. Given the need for transformational change, how optimistic are you that this can happen?
Well, look, I'll show my cards. If Trump is reelected, my pessimism will turn to the blackest despair because I don't think we have another chance. I really have a strong feeling that 4 more years of this is a permanent condition that will have consequences for maybe my children's entire lives. So for me, nothing matters more, and everything depends on a new president, because this one is catastrophic. Beyond that, though, you have to be pretty naive to think that that's the solution to our problems, because the problems precede him. Mm-hmm. They are deep, they are structural, they are they come from a country that is so divided against itself that each side thinks that what I just said is true. Without getting rid of the other side's president, the country will be destroyed, which is a pretty grim state of affairs. So we can't wish away the other half of the country. It's something I've seen in other countries that are in civil war or close to civil war, where each side thinks that they represent the real people and that all they have to do is get rid of the other side and then the country will be beautiful. It won't be that way, because we have to live together and we're not going to have a civil war. We're not going to have secession again. So how do we work it out when the level of trust and even the sense of living in the same country has declined to the level it's at now? So I think it's just going to take, the only thing that makes me hopeful is that I'm hearing enough of what I said from others that this pandemic has been an alarm bell, a really loud alarm bell, that we mustn't let ourselves forget. As the shutdown slowly ends and life resumes, even though it will never be quite the same, we mustn't forget what we're learning right now, because I think we have not been so open-eyed and clear-headed in a long time, and that's a good thing.
Great. We got about 20 minutes left. Gina, let's see if we can get to as many questions as possible. Let's go to the next one.
Since our federal government isn't effectively responding to this pandemic, are you familiar with any multinational efforts which lie outside the government sector?
I mean, I'm aware of what various nonprofits, aid groups are doing. They're mostly trying to raise money because everyone is going broke right now. But what multinational groups are doing in this country, that I don't really know of anything on a big scale, if that was the question.
Yeah.
Instead, it's better to look at the lower levels. What's interesting is how, because of the abdication of the federal government, this is really turning into and this is back to the failed state metaphor, it's becoming a regional effort and a local effort where governors are making decisions alone or with other governors in their region that are totally at odds with what someone 2 states over might be doing. It's as if we're going back to the United States are, as people said before the Civil War, because we have so little cohesion now at the national level, and a president who's actively trying to tear apart whatever bonds are left that are holding our national polity and society together. In that extremity, states are doing what they can and are competing with each other or cooperating with each other. And it's a situation I don't know that we've seen in this country in 150 years. It's a strange thing for the governor of New York to say that he's going to be the one to decide when New York comes back to work and that the president doesn't have that authority. And for the president to say, no, I do have that authority. It's just a very, I don't know, it has a 19th century feel to it, as if the Constitution has not quite taken effect yet. And we're still joined by Articles of Confederation that are, not working very well.
Yeah, that is an ominous historical reference. Let's go to the next question.
Given our lack of leadership at the top of the opposition party, what is your advice for us if we want to mobilize grassroots forces or pressure our leadership to speak out about the destruction of our democracy and to lead on the rebuilding of our institutions?
Well, I think this year, the most important effort has to be electoral. And that means it's going to be a difficult battle because the normal get out the vote activities, voter registration activities are going to be difficult, if not impossible. We don't know yet whether people will be able to go door to door to register voters, whether the November elections will happen in the normal way, or whether it will be 50% absentee or 100% absentee. I would say be alert to any erosion that you see happening of the right and ability of voters to get to the polls or to vote in November. That's maybe the single most important thing is making sure our elected officials and our media are entirely riveted to the possibility that we may not have a fair election. We may not have an election in November. I think anything is possible right now. And it calls for extreme vigilance and activism, but it's hard to know exactly what form that takes because we are all stuck at home. So for now, it's the online variety.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, the next one is also a two-part question. Is the hollowing out of government a long-term impact, even if there is a change of administrations in January? Can the exodus of expertise be overcome by the next generation who has witnessed how callously public servants have been treated?
Yeah, that's a great question. This hollowing out has been going on for a while. It certainly precedes Trump. I had a cover story in The Atlantic just before the coronavirus took over all of our lives called How to Destroy a Government. And it was a report on exactly that question. And it looked at the State Department and the Justice Department and how Trump has gotten rid of people he saw as disloyal, how he's essentially created a loyalty test, not to the Constitution, but to him for those who are remaining, and has filled a lot of positions with political appointees in acting capacity so that they're totally dependent on him. And how many people are leaving or will leave if he gets reelected. So it's bad, but it started before that. I mean, presidents have been appointing donors to important ambassadorships as thank yous for quite a long time. It has accelerated with Trump, as everything has, but it started well before Trump. And so did the sense that civil servants somehow, a sense in the public maybe, that they're not on the level, that they are either partisans of one party or the other, or part of a corrupt swamp. They're either swamp creatures or agents of the deep state. All of this was a feeling Americans were beginning to have, or some Americans, and that Trump exploited. He didn't create that feeling. He exploited it, and he has now made it a lot worse by really dividing the country into those who think the government is to be trusted and should be given the independence to do what it should do, and the part of the country that thinks that it's working to get rid of Trump. So I would say one thing a new president could do is simply to say, I'm not going to appoint high-flying, high-paying donors to be my top ambassadors. I'm not going to put hacks into key top or mid-level offices around the federal government. In fact, I'm going to lower the number of political appointees and start filling those deputy secretary and assistant secretary positions with career people, because they actually are better at it and they are less likely to be in it for the short-term gain to themselves. So there are things a new president could do that would actually signal to the country and to the bureaucracy that it's going to be different this time.
Great. Let's go to the next question with about just a little bit over 10 minutes left.
No doubt winning the presidency in November is final. What are your thoughts about winning the Senate with respect, I think final was maybe not the right word there, but what are your thoughts about winning the Senate with respect to naming Supreme Court justices?
I mean, if you are a Democrat, you have to see that as a key battle. The Republicans have been incredibly successful at pushing through unprecedented numbers of lower court judges and of securing a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And they've done it partly by ignoring common practice, like allowing presidents to have their nominees get a hearing in the Senate, as Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, wasn't allowed. But they've also done it by caring more than Democrats. I think the courts have always meant more, at least since the Reagan years, to Republicans who maybe see their long-term importance to the issues they care about more than Democrats have. So I guess part of, if Democrats want to stop the hemorrhaging of the courts and to start creating more of a ideological balance on the courts, they should take it more seriously. But it would also be good if somehow our courts could be pushed back toward the ideal of being somewhat removed from politics. It's never been true, of course, because they are a crucial branch of government and they are appointed and they have their own views. But there was at least at different times an effort to create conditions where they could act as if they are above politics. And I'd like to see a president take some steps and a Senate take some steps to make that happen. You know, one way might be to change the kind of fraudulent process by which Supreme Court justices now appear before the Senate during their confirmation hearings, which has become a game that everyone sees through. No one believes it, but somehow we can't get away from it. It would be nice to have an actual serious conversation about legal issues in which the nominee has to kind of tell the truth. And that would actually perhaps set a precedent that could be a good one.
Great. Okay, moving right along, let's go to the next question.
Okay, the next one's a little bit more lighthearted. This person wants to know, what books have you been reading during quarantine and which stick out and why?
I love that question. Oddly enough, before the pandemic hit, I was reading, get this, The Plague by Albert Camus, which I forced myself to finish during the pandemic, but which didn't make me any happier. I read The Brothers Karamazov, which is just it transports you into a totally different world and is a crazy book, a brilliant, crazy book, all about what matters in life and brotherhood and God and all the big questions the 19th century Russian novelists kept hammering away at. And right now I'm reading Jill Lepore's These Truths, her one-volume American history. I'm looking for sources of insight and inspiration in our past. None of this is very lighthearted, I acknowledge, but Lincoln's speeches are always, for me, a source of just discovery and of awe, just that he was such a good writer. So I've been reading Lepore and Lincoln side by side and hoping that there are lessons in American history that we can learn from in order to get through this nightmare and to the other side, because they've been there before.
That is a great question. And George, before we say goodbye in about 8 minutes, I do have one final question that actually is about books and about history. But let's go back to our distinguished audience and go through a few more questions before we have to say goodbye.
Sure.
Gina?
Actually, we just have one more question from the audience. And this one relates to Richard Holbrooke. Holbrooke is known for the Balkans. Subsequently, some feel he perhaps started a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. In your book, you say he likely would not have made much progress in Afghanistan. Do you think he was overrated as a peacemaker?
You know, I don't think diplomats are like baseball players where like what you're looking at is their batting average. Because honestly, ending one war in a diplomatic career, especially over these past 30 years, is a remarkable thing. So I don't look much beyond the Balkans and Dayton for a reason to think that Richard Holbrooke was an immensely talented negotiator, politician, diplomat, all of those things. I don't think he restarted that Ethiopia-Eritrea war. I actually talked to a lot of people about that. I think he kind of blundered into it in an arrogant, high-handed way that was typical of him, but the war was about to restart anyway. Afghanistan, you know, It's a long story. It's a sad story. He was past his prime. He did not understand Barack Obama and why Obama didn't seem to like him. And Obama did not understand Richard Holbrooke and how he could put Richard Holbrooke to use in Afghanistan. And so the two of them never could connect. Holbrooke had one urgent insight, which was we must negotiate with the Taliban in order to end this war. We cannot do it on the battlefield. And because of his own flaws, this is Shakespearean, his own flaws and also Obama's blindness to him, he never really got the chance to do that before he died. And so there's a lot of might have beens at the end of Holbrooke's life. But he did a lot of things, including some things people don't even know about, like saving the United States seat at the UN when we were about to get kicked out for not paying our dues. So he had a pretty remarkable career, and he was also a maddening and mesmerizing man, which is why I wanted to write about him.
Great. I want to give an opportunity to Ambassador Christoher Hill, who's joining us tonight. He knows you, George, better than anyone else in tonight's conversation. So Chris, do you want to pose a question, say a few words to George? You know, we've got about 5 minutes left. I do want to pose one more question, but the floor is yours if you want to take advantage.
Okay, well, I would just say as a general comment that I think George is correct that a lot depends on this upcoming election. There's no question about that. But he's also correct to say that a lot of the problems preceded this election. To turn government jobs into a sort of semi-show business, which is what is really going on. And I think this president of ours learned that this is a serious means to a serious end with this pandemic. And I think the next president needs to be a serious person and needs to work with others. So that's kind of an overall comment. And but I do believe in the resiliency of this country. I do believe we pick ourselves up. But I just would like to make a couple of comments about Holbrooke. I think one of the first questions was how would he do in these times? And I think George is quite right. These were not his times, and he could never work in an administration like the Trump administration. But you know, he had trouble working in other administrations. I mean, this is a guy who should have been Secretary of State 3 times over, and he concluded his career essentially as an assistant secretary. One thing I can say with certainty is he never would have allowed this China relationship to deteriorate as it's done. He never would have allowed China to become the be-all and end-all of excuses for everything our country has done. I think he would have fought that mightily because I think he believed in the U.S.-China relationship. He understood that 1.3 billion people are not going to disappear. He understood really the necessity of working with a country like that. He would not, for example, as Secretary Pompeo has done, where Pompeo was slighted by Wang Yi in October 2018 and has not been back to China since then. Holbrooke would have been back every week in Wang Yi's face until Wang Yi made him his best friend. That's just kind of how Holbrooke operated. And as for the pandemic, Holbrooke would have understood the vital need for working with others, for building coalitions. He would have been in Europe constantly. He certainly would have been in East Asia. And frankly, if he could get enough PPE, he would have been on the front lines of this thing. He always felt that you could never understand a story until you were really out there. And you know, obviously there are tremendous dangers in this COVID-19 crisis, but Holbrooke would have shown people that he understands what people are going through in this, which in short, he had empathy, and he also understood the need to see things firsthand. So those were a few comments. I mean, I agree with George. He was pain in the neck, and a lot of people couldn't work with him. But, you know, I think George agrees with me. I miss him every day of the week.
Chris, I would not have devoted 5 years of my life to writing about the man if I didn't feel that it's harder to live without him than with him.
Great. Well, on that note, I did have a question, but I don't want to keep you, George, longer than.
Go ahead, Nader. We can have one more question.
Okay, one more big question. I mean, I as you know, I deeply respect your mind. I think you're a wonderful writer, a wonderful public intellectual, and a good student of history. And one of the books that I'm reading right now is John Barry's widely acclaimed book on the 1918 pandemic called The Great Influenza. And as I read through the book and I discover the huge impact that pandemic had, not just on the United States, but on our world. You know, conservative estimate that about 50 million people were killed about 100 years ago because of this pandemic. And in the United States alone, you know, 675,000 people were killed in 1918 and 1919. That's more than the number of Americans who died in World War I, World War II, the Korea War, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And the question that is literally keeping me up at night is, why is there no historical memory of this? You know, ask how many people knew about the details of the 1918 pandemic prior to March of this year. There's no memorials. It's not taught in our history. There's a gap. There's a huge gap, and that just doesn't make sense to me, given where we are today, but also given the huge loss of life in this country. Do you have any thoughts as to, you know, why there is that gaping hole in our historical understanding of these questions?
Well, I haven't read Barry's book, but I heard him on a podcast say that it was sort of repressed immediately. It was not talked about. It was coming immediately at the end of World War I. It was just too much pain, and American leaders and the American people just wanted to move on and get into the roaring 20s. So it was not, there was no cultural representation of it. No one wrote a novel or made a film or gave a speech. It just was repressed. And, you know, maybe we were more used to death at an early age and on a large scale back then. There were lots of communicable diseases that were terrifying. Polio. My mother was telling me, she's just turned 95, and she was telling me that she remembered her mother taking her down to the local swimming pool at 7 a.m. in the summer before the other kids got there, so that the chances of getting polio would be. So life was a lot more precarious back then. And maybe 675,000 flu deaths seemed less enormous. But the other thing is, we Americans just don't believe in history in some fundamental ways. We are always moving on and reinventing ourselves and discovering the next thing. And we are not given to picking at our wounds and probing them for lessons. We want to get on with it. But back then we could get on with it because we were still a pretty young country. And in fact, our global greatness was ahead of us. It was not there yet. I think of the American century as beginning really in 1941 when we entered World War II. So we were young and had that ability of young people to be resilient and to recover quickly and to get on with life. And now I feel we are older and our health is not as good. And this pandemic, though it's not on that scale, I think is going to have a more lasting effect than the great flu of 1918-19, which killed, so at this point, 10 times as many people.
Great. George, you know, this has really been wonderful. I regret that we couldn't do this in person.
Of course.
But thank you very much for being with us. Please take good care. Please keep writing, and please pass on my regards to Laura.
I will.
You can meet in person sometime in the near future.
I enjoyed it, and I wish all of you good health and safety. And
Okay, we'll say goodbye to you, and we'll have some concluding remarks with Judith. Thanks again, George.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, George.
Thank you. Judith, the floor is yours. We can't hear you, Judith. There you go.
It says you are muted by the host.
No, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. So you said you were sorry we couldn't have done that in person. I felt like it was in person. I felt like we were so close to him. And to have this chance to hear this deep thinker, this passionate thinker talk was just an enormous gift, Nader, that you arranged. So what I want to tell everybody is this is the last of our 5th year, and there will be some new format, some changes for next year, but we can talk all about that later. But what I want people to know is Nader's going on sabbatical, and we want him to have a wonderful sabbatical year, but we are going to miss him so much because he has brought us this wealth of brain food for year after year. And we're so grateful to you, Nader. And you've been so generous. You give us your time and you always bring us the best. So we want you to have a wonderful year. And the fact that our Majlis events just run like clockwork, and we always have such creative things with them. That is Gina Janone, and we have to thank her for another season of great service also. So we will be in touch about the next season, but thank you, Nader, and have a wonderful year.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Please stay safe. Take care. Hope we can meet again. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.